March 10th, 1876. Boston, Massachusetts. A cramped attic workshop on Exeter Place. Alexander Graham Bell bent over a crude device made of wire, metal, and acid. In the next room, his assistant Thomas Watson pressed his ear against a similar contraption, waiting. Bell spoke into the device. 3 words. Simple. Desperate. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Watson heard them. Not through walls. Not shouted. But transmitted electrically through wire. A human voice, converted to vibrations, carried by current, and reconstituted as sound. Watson rushed into the room, eyes wide. "Mr. Bell, I heard you. I could hear what you said." It was the first sentence ever spoken over a telephone. A moment so ordinary it seemed meaningless. Yet everything had just changed. For the first time in human history, a voice had traveled farther than breath could carry it, preserved not as written words, but as sound itself. Living, immediate, undeniably human. But this moment didn't begin in 1876. It began decades earlier, in workshops and laboratories scattered across 2 continents, where forgotten men dreamed of impossibilities. Men who inhaled chemical fumes, bankrupted themselves, and died in obscurity, all chasing a vision that seemed like fantasy, to make voices flow through metal like water through pipes. The story of the telephone is not the story of one genius inventor. It's the story of obsession, of brilliant minds working in isolation, each building on fragments of knowledge, each falling just short of the breakthrough, until finally, someone crossed the threshold. And when that happened, the world discovered it had been waiting for this invention without knowing it existed. Before the telephone, distance meant silence. If you wanted to speak to someone, they had to be within earshot. Shouting carried your voice perhaps a few hundred feet. Beyond that, nothing. The only way to send messages across miles was to write them down and physically transport them. A letter from New York to San Francisco took weeks. Urgent news traveled by telegraph, a system that transmitted coded clicks representing letters, not actual voices. The telegraph, invented in the 1830s and 1840s, was revolutionary. Messages could cross continents in minutes. But telegraph communication was limited. Operators translated messages into Morse code, transmitted them as electrical pulses, and decoded them on the other end. Only trained professionals could send or receive telegrams. The system was efficient for simple messages, but useless for conversation. You couldn't hear emotion. You couldn't interrupt or clarify. You couldn't speak naturally. Some inventors wondered, could sound itself be transmitted electrically? Could the human voice travel through wires the way telegraph signals did? The idea seemed absurd. Sound was vibration in air. Electricity was current flowing through metal. How could one become the other? The first serious attempt came from Charles Bourseul, a French telegraph engineer. In 1854, Bourseul published a paper proposing that sound vibrations could be converted to electrical signals. He suggested using a diaphragm connected to an electrical circuit. When sound waves struck the diaphragm, it would vibrate, causing electrical current to fluctuate in sympathy. On the receiving end, another diaphragm would vibrate in response to the electrical fluctuations, recreating the original sound. Bourseul's theory was elegant, but he never built a working device. He lacked the technical skills and resources. More importantly, nobody took him seriously. The scientific community dismissed the idea as impractical fantasy. Bourseul abandoned the project and faded into obscurity. For years, his paper sat unread in French technical journals, a forgotten blueprint for the future. If you're captivated by the forgotten pioneers whose visions shaped our connected world, subscribe to Retro Files and journey back to the experiments that changed everything. In Germany, another inventor was closer to success. Johann Philipp Reis, a schoolteacher with a passion for physics, read Bourseul's paper and decided to build what Bourseul had only described. Between 1860 and 1863, Reis constructed a series of devices he called telephones, a word he coined from Greek roots meaning distant sound. Reis's telephone used a diaphragm attached to a metal contact. Sound vibrations caused the contact to open and close rapidly, creating a pulsing electrical signal. On the receiving end, an electromagnet caused a needle to vibrate against a wooden resonator, producing sound. The device worked after a fashion. It could transmit simple tones and, occasionally, fragments of speech. But the sound quality was terrible, distorted, faint, barely intelligible. Rees demonstrated his telephone across Germany, presenting it to scientific societies and academic audiences. Some were impressed. Most were skeptical. The device seemed like a novelty, a scientific curiosity with no practical application. Rees died in 1874, believing himself a failure. His obituaries barely mentioned the telephone. History would remember him as a footnote, if at all. But Rees had proven something crucial. Transmitting sound electrically was possible. The question was no longer whether it could be done, but how to do it well. The answer would come from an unlikely source, a man who wasn't an engineer or physicist, but a teacher of the deaf. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1847. His father and grandfather were both experts in elocution and speech. His mother was nearly deaf, which gave young Alexander an intimate understanding of sound and hearing. Bell's childhood was saturated with the mechanics of speech, how sounds were produced, how they were perceived, how the deaf could be taught to speak through careful instruction. In 1870, Bell immigrated to Canada with his family, seeking a healthier climate after two of his brothers died of tuberculosis. A year later, he moved to Boston to open a school for training teachers of the deaf. Bell was passionate about his work. He believed the deaf could be integrated into hearing society through speech rather than sign language. This belief was controversial and would later be criticized, but it drove Bell's entire career. Bell's work with the deaf led him to study acoustics obsessively. He built devices to visualize sound waves. He experimented with tuning forks, resonators, and membranes. He became fascinated by the question of how sound could be transformed into other forms and back again. Could sound become light? Could it become electricity? Could it travel through wires? By 1874, Bell was convinced that a harmonic telegraph was possible, a system that could transmit multiple telegraph messages simultaneously over a single wire by using different frequencies. This would revolutionize telecommunications and make whoever invented it wealthy. Bell wasn't just a dreamer. He was also a practical man who needed money. He found a patron in Gardiner Green Hubbard, a wealthy lawyer and businessman whose daughter Mabel was one of Bell's deaf students. Bell and Mabel would later marry, but in 1874, their relationship was just beginning. Hubbard agreed to finance Bell's experiments in exchange for a share of any resulting patents. He also provided something equally valuable: Thomas Watson, a skilled mechanic who could turn Bell's theoretical ideas into working devices. Watson was 20 years old, trained in electrical work, and eager for interesting projects. Bell was 27, brilliant but impractical, full of ideas but lacking hands-on skills. They were perfect complements. Bell would describe what he wanted. Watson would build it. Together, they worked nights and weekends in a rented attic workshop, pursuing the harmonic telegraph. But Bell's mind kept wandering to a more ambitious idea. If different frequencies could be transmitted simultaneously, couldn't the complex vibrations of the human voice also be transmitted? The voice was just a combination of frequencies. In theory, if you could capture those frequencies and transmit them electrically, you could transmit speech. Bell began sketching designs for what he called a speaking telegraph. The concept was similar to Rees's telephone, but more sophisticated. Bell proposed using a membrane that would vibrate in response to sound waves. The membrane would be attached to a coil of wire positioned near a magnet. As the membrane vibrated, the coil would move relative to the magnet, inducing a fluctuating electrical current. This current would flow through a wire to a receiver, where the process would reverse. Electrical fluctuations would cause a membrane to vibrate, recreating the original sound. This was the principle of electromagnetic induction, discovered by Michael Faraday decades earlier. Bell wasn't inventing new physics. He was applying known principles in a new way. But making it work required exquisite precision. The vibrations of speech were subtle and complex. Any distortion would render speech unintelligible. The device needed to respond to frequencies across the entire range of human hearing, from low bass tones to high treble sounds. Bell and Watson spent months experimenting. They built membrane diaphragms from various materials. They tested different coil configurations. They adjusted the distance between coils and magnets. Most attempts failed completely. Occasionally, they would hear faint sounds, clicks, buzzes, something that might have been speech but was too distorted to understand. Progress was agonizingly slow. Hubbard was growing impatient. He had financed Bell's work expecting the harmonic telegraph, which had clear commercial value. The speaking telegraph seemed like an expensive distraction. Hubbard pressured Bell to focus on the harmonic system and file patents before competitors beat them to it. Bell was torn. The harmonic telegraph was achievable and profitable, but the speaking telegraph was revolutionary. It would transform human communication in ways the harmonic telegraph never could. Bell wanted both, but lacked time and resources to pursue both simultaneously. In early 1876, Bell learned that Elisha Gray, another inventor, was also working on telegraph improvements and possibly a speaking telegraph. Gray was backed by Western Union, the telegraph monopoly. He had vastly more resources than Bell. The race was on. On February 14, 1876, Bell filed a patent application for the telephone. On the same day, Elisha Gray filed a patent caveat, a preliminary notice of invention, for a similar device. Bell's application arrived at the patent office hours before Gray's caveat. Those few hours would determine who would be remembered as the telephone's inventor. Hashtag the forgotten experiment that let voices travel through wires. The patent was granted on March 7, 1876. 3 days later, Bell achieved what the patent described: the first successful transmission of intelligible speech. The famous sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you," wasn't planned as a historic declaration. Bell had accidentally spilled battery acid on himself and called for help. Watson, in the next room with the receiving device, heard every word clearly. They had done it. The telephone worked. But success in a workshop didn't mean success in the world. Bell needed to demonstrate the telephone publicly, convince skeptics it was real, and prove it had practical value. The device that transmitted speech across 2 rooms needed to work across miles. And Bell needed to beat competitors who were already building their own versions. The first public demonstration came at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in June 1876. The Centennial celebrated America's 100th birthday and showcased technological marvels from around the world. Bell set up a small exhibit displaying his telephone. Most visitors ignored it, gravitating toward more impressive displays: giant steam engines, exotic machinery, elaborate pavilions from foreign nations. Bell's exhibit consisted of 2 simple devices connected by wire. 1 transmitter, 1 receiver. Nothing spectacular to look at. Judges walked past it repeatedly. Bell grew desperate. His future depended on recognition, and nobody was paying attention. Then, by chance, Dom Pedro II, the Emperor of Brazil, visited the exhibition. Dom Pedro had met Bell months earlier and remembered him. He stopped at Bell's exhibit and asked for a demonstration. Bell spoke into the transmitter. Across the room, Dom Pedro held the receiver to his ear. His eyes widened. "My God, it talks!" he exclaimed. The Emperor's enthusiasm drew a crowd. Other judges rushed over to try the device themselves. Each one pressed the receiver to their ear and heard Bell's voice, transmitted electrically, perfectly recognizable. The demonstration was a sensation. Newspapers reported the telephone as one of the exhibition's marvels. To explore more stories of how simple experiments became world-changing inventions, subscribe to Retrofiles and witness the moments that connected humanity. But public enthusiasm didn't immediately translate to commercial success. The telephone was impressive as a novelty, but what was it actually good for? Telegraph companies dismissed it as a toy. Why would anyone need to transmit voices when telegrams worked perfectly well? Western Union, the dominant communications company, showed no interest in purchasing Bell's patents. Bell and his partners, Watson, Hubbard, and Hubbard's associate Thomas Sanders, decided to commercialize the telephone themselves. They formed the Bell Telephone Company in July 1877. Their business model was simple: lease telephones to customers in pairs. 2 businesses or households could rent telephones and connect them with private wire. This created point-to-point communication, useful for specific applications but limited in scope. Early customers were skeptical. The devices were expensive to install and maintain. Sound quality was poor over any significant distance. Conversations were often interrupted by static, interference, and faint signals. And the system required dedicated wires between each pair of telephones. If you wanted to talk to 10 different people, you needed 10 separate telephone connections. Despite these limitations, some businesses saw value. Factories used telephones to communicate between buildings. Police and fire departments installed them for emergency coordination. Banks connected their branches. Newspapers used them to receive breaking news from correspondents. These early adopters proved the telephone had practical applications beyond novelty. The breakthrough came with the telephone exchange. Instead of dedicating wires between every pair of users, why not create a central switching station? Each telephone would connect to the exchange. When someone wanted to make a call, they would contact the exchange operator, who would physically connect their line to the recipient's line using switches and plugs. This created a network where any subscriber could reach any other subscriber. The first commercial telephone exchange opened in New Haven, Connecticut in January 1878. It served 21 customers. Operators, initially young men, later replaced by women who were considered more polite and patient, worked at switchboards, connecting calls by hand. The system was clumsy but revolutionary. For the first time, telephone users could reach multiple people without installing separate wires to each location. Exchanges proliferated rapidly. By the end of 1878, telephone exchanges operated in dozens of American cities. By 1880, there were nearly 50,000 telephones in use. The telephone was transitioning from novelty to necessity. Businesses that adopted telephones gained competitive advantages. They could respond to customers instantly, coordinate operations in real time, and conduct business at speeds impossible through written correspondence. But technical problems remained severe. Early telephones transmitted sound poorly. Users had to shout to be heard. Background noise overwhelmed conversations. Long-distance calls were nearly impossible. Signals faded rapidly over distances beyond a few miles. The telephone worked for local communication but couldn't challenge the telegraph for long-distance messaging. Thomas Edison improved the transmitter in 1877 by using carbon granules. Sound waves caused the diaphragm to compress the carbon, changing its electrical resistance and creating a stronger, clearer signal. Edison's carbon microphone became standard in telephones for nearly a century. It dramatically improved sound quality and transmission distance, making the telephone practical for everyday use. Meanwhile, legal battles erupted. Elisha Gray sued Bell, claiming priority of invention. Western Union, realizing it had dismissed a valuable technology, began installing its own telephone systems using patents from Gray and Edison. Bell Telephone Company sued Western Union for patent infringement. The case threatened to destroy Bell's company. If Western Union won, Bell would be reduced to a minor player in the industry his invention created. The lawsuit was settled in 1879. Western Union agreed to exit the telephone business and recognize Bell's patents in exchange for a share of Bell Telephone's revenues. It was a complete victory for Bell. Western Union's retreat gave Bell Telephone Company a near monopoly on telephone service in America. The company would grow into AT&T, dominating American telecommunications for a century. With legal threats resolved and technology improving, telephone adoption accelerated. The 1880s saw explosive growth. Urban areas were wired with thousands of telephone lines strung on poles or buried underground. Operators worked around the clock at expanding exchanges. Telephone directories listed subscribers and their numbers. The telephone became essential business infrastructure. But residential adoption was slower. Telephones were expensive. Installation required running wires to homes, a significant expense in an era when electrical wiring itself was rare. And many people didn't see the need. What would ordinary families do with telephones? Who would they call? Letters and telegrams served most communication needs. This perception changed gradually as telephone networks expanded. Once enough people had telephones, the value of having one increased. You could call the doctor in emergencies. You could check on distant relatives. You could make social arrangements without exchanging letters. The telephone transformed from a business tool into a social technology. Women became the telephone's primary residential users. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women were often socially isolated, especially in suburban and rural areas. The telephone provided connection to the outside world. Women used it to maintain friendships, coordinate social activities, and participate in community life without leaving home. The telephone became associated with women's domestic sphere. creating gender dynamics that persisted for decades. Rural areas initially lacked telephone service. Stringing wires to isolated farms and small towns was expensive and unprofitable. But rural residents recognized the telephone's value. Farmers needed to check market prices, order supplies, and call for help in emergencies. Rural communities began forming cooperative telephone companies, building their own networks with volunteer labor and minimal capital. These rural telephone systems were primitive. Lines were often barbed wire strung on fence posts. Multiple households shared party lines, where everyone could hear everyone else's conversations. Privacy was non-existent, but the systems worked well enough. By the early 1900s, even remote farms, long-distance calling remained a great challenge. Signals weakened rapidly over long wires. Amplification technology didn't exist yet. A call from New York to Chicago was barely audible. A call from New York to San Francisco was impossible. The telephone was revolutionary for local communication, but useless for the vast distances that separated American cities. The solution came from an unexpected source: vacuum tube amplifiers. Lita Forrest invented the audion tube in 1906, a device that could amplify weak electrical signals. Initially developed for radio, the audion tube revolutionized long-distance telephony. Amplifiers could be placed at intervals along telephone lines, boosting signals to maintain clarity over vast distances. By 1915, transcontinental telephone service was inaugurated. Alexander Graham Bell, now 68 years old, made a ceremonial call from New York to Thomas Watson in San Francisco, repeating his famous first sentence, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Watson replied, "It would take me a week now." The country that had seemed impossibly vast was suddenly connected. You could speak to someone on the opposite coast as easily as someone across town. Transatlantic telephone service came later, in 1927, using radio transmission since undersea cables couldn't yet carry voice signals reliably. A call from New York to London cost $75 for 3 minutes, equivalent to over $1,000 today. Only the wealthy and powerful could afford it. But the principle was established. Distance no longer mattered. Voices could travel anywhere. The telephone's social impact was profound and often unexpected. It changed courtship and romance. Young people could conduct private conversations without chaperones present, enabling relationships that would have been impossible in earlier eras. It changed emergency response. Police and fire departments could coordinate rapidly, saving lives that would have been lost in the time it took to send messengers. It changed business. Companies could operate across wider geographic areas, coordinating far-flung operations in real time. The telephone also changed language. New vocabulary emerged. Hello became the standard greeting, replacing more formal salutations. People developed telephone etiquette: when to call, how long to talk, how to politely end conversations. Telephone voices became distinct from in-person voices. People spoke differently on the phone, adjusting their tone and cadence for the medium. Telephone operators became a significant occupation, employing hundreds of thousands of women. Operating required skill, connecting calls quickly, handling difficult customers, managing multiple simultaneous requests. Operators were the human interface of the telephone system, essential to its function. Their work was invisible to most users, but crucial to the system's operation. Automatic switching, developed in the 1890s, threatened to eliminate operators. Almond Stroger, an undertaker who suspected telephone operators were diverting his business to competitors, invented an automatic switch that allowed callers to directly dial numbers without operator assistance. Stroger's system used rotary dials and mechanical selectors to route calls automatically. Automatic exchanges spread slowly. They were expensive to install and maintain. But they offered advantages. They never tired, never made mistakes, and eliminated privacy concerns about operators listening to calls. By mid-20th century, most telephone systems were fully automatic. Operators remained only for long-distance calls and special services. #the forgotten experiment that let voices travel through wires. By the 1920s, the telephone had become ordinary. In major American cities, most businesses and many households had telephone service. The device that had seemed miraculous 50 years earlier was now infrastructure, as unremarkable as running water or electricity. People used telephones without thinking about the technology that made them possible. The wonder had faded into familiarity. But the telephone's transformation of society was just beginning. The technology that allowed voices to travel through wires would eventually enable voices to travel through air, through space, through digital networks that wouldn't exist for decades. The telephone was not an endpoint, but a beginning. The first step toward a world where communication was instant, universal, and eventually taken for granted. The Depression and World War II both accelerated telephone development. Economic hardship made long-distance calls luxury expenses for most families, but businesses continued expanding telephone use. During the war, telephone systems became critical military infrastructure. Secure communications required new technologies. The military invested heavily in improving reliability, capacity, and security of telephone networks. After the war, telephone service exploded. Returning soldiers formed families in new suburbs that needed telephone infrastructure built from scratch. The post-war economic boom made telephones affordable for working-class families. By 1950, two-thirds of American households had telephone service. By 1970, that figure exceeded 90%. The telephone had completed its journey from luxury to necessity. To discover more stories of how simple inventions rewired the fabric of human connection, subscribe to Retro Files and explore the experiments that changed everything. Touch-tone dialing, introduced in the 1960s, replaced rotary dials. Instead of mechanical pulses generated by rotating dials, touch-tone phones used electronic tones. Each button generated a unique frequency combination. Touch-tone was faster and more reliable than rotary dialing. It also enabled interactive systems where callers could navigate menus by pressing buttons, creating the automated phone systems that would become ubiquitous. The 1960s and 1970s saw telephone technology become increasingly electronic. Mechanical switches were replaced by electronic ones. Analog signals began transitioning to digital. Fiber optic cables, which transmitted signals as light pulses through glass fibers, offered vastly greater capacity than copper wires. These improvements were invisible to users, but transformed the system's capabilities. More calls could be carried simultaneously. Quality improved. Long-distance costs dropped. Cellular telephones emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. The concept was simple but technically challenging. Divide geographic areas into cells, each served by a radio transmitter. Mobile phones would communicate with nearby transmitters. As users moved, calls would automatically transfer between cells. This required sophisticated coordination and computing power that barely existed when the concept was first proposed in the 1940s. The first commercial cellular network launched in Japan in 1979. American service began in 1983. Early cellular phones were expensive, bulky, and had limited coverage. They were status symbols for wealthy business people, not practical tools for average people. But the technology improved rapidly. Phones shrank. Coverage expanded. Prices dropped. By the 1990s, cellular phones were common. The shift from wired to wireless telephony was more than technical evolution. It represented a fundamental change in what telephones were. For a century, telephones had been fixed to locations. You called places, homes, offices, businesses, not people. You had no way to reach someone who wasn't near a telephone. But cellular phones belonged to individuals. You called people, not places. This subtle shift had profound implications for how people thought about communication and connection. Answering machines and voicemail changed telephone dynamics. For the first time, calls could be received asynchronously. You no longer needed to be present when someone called. This reduced urgency while increasing convenience. It also created new social anxieties. Was it rude not to answer the phone? How long should you wait before returning calls? When was it acceptable to screen calls? These questions had no precedent in earlier telephone etiquette. Caller ID, introduced in the 1980s, revealed another shift. For most of telephone history, calls were anonymous until answered. Caller ID ended this anonymity, allowing recipients to decide whether to answer based on who was calling. This gave recipients control, but also created expectations. If you saw someone called and didn't answer, they knew you were avoiding them. Privacy and social dynamics both changed. The telephone's impact on human psychology was subtle but pervasive. The device created expectations of immediate availability. Before telephones, if someone wanted to contact you, they wrote a letter or visited in person, both of which allowed time for consideration. But telephone calls demanded immediate responses. You answered or you didn't. This created a sense of obligation and interruption that pervaded modern life. Telephones also changed how people experience presence and absence. A voice on the telephone was somehow more present than a letter, but less present than face-to-face interaction. This created a strange liminal space where people were simultaneously together and apart. Long-distance relationships maintained through telephone calls felt more real than those maintained through letters, but they also highlighted physical separation more acutely. Children growing up in the telephone era developed different social skills than previous generations. They learned to communicate without visual cues, relying solely on voice to convey meaning and emotion. They became comfortable with the telephone's conventions, the slight delay, the distortion, the absence of body language. These skills would later transfer to other forms of mediated communication: video calls, instant messaging, social media. The telephone also created new forms of crime and deception. Telephone fraud emerged almost immediately after widespread adoption. Scammers could impersonate anyone, claim anything, and disappear. The telephone's anonymity and distance enabled deceptions that would be harder to execute in person. Obscene phone calls, threatening calls, and harassing calls all exploited the medium's characteristics. The telephone that connected people also enabled new forms of violation. By the 1990s, the telephone network was transitioning from analog to digital. Voices were converted to data, compressed, transmitted, and reconstructed. This allowed many more calls to share the same physical infrastructure. It also enabled integration with computer networks. The telephone and the internet, which had developed separately, were converging into a unified communications infrastructure. Voice over Internet Protocol, VoIP, allowed telephone calls to be transmitted over the internet rather than traditional telephone networks. Services like Skype, introduced in 2003, offered free or low-cost calling to anyone with internet access. This undermined the business model that had sustained telephone companies for over a century. Calling was no longer a metered service. It was essentially free, bundled with internet access. Smartphones, beginning with the iPhone in 2007, completed the telephone's transformation. These devices were computers that happened to include telephone capability. The telephone app was just one icon among many, often not the most frequently used. Calling was just one communication option among many: text messaging, email, social media, video chat. The telephone's primacy was ending. Yet the impact of Bell's invention persisted. Every form of electronic communication that followed built on principles established by the telephone. The idea that voices could be converted to electrical signals, transmitted over distance, and reconstructed, this fundamental insight underpinned everything that came after. Radio broadcasting, television, digital communication, the internet, all were descendants of the telephone. The telephone had taught humanity a profound lesson: distance could be overcome. For most of human history, physical separation meant isolation. People separated by miles might as well have been separated by worlds. They could exchange letters, but letters took time. Real-time communication required physical presence. The telephone shattered this limitation. You could speak to someone across the country as easily as someone across the room. This created both liberation and burden. The liberation was obvious. Loved ones could stay connected, business could operate across distances, emergencies could be addressed quickly. But the burden was subtler. The telephone created expectations of constant availability. It collapsed the buffer that distance once provided. You could no longer escape by being somewhere else. If someone wanted to reach you, they could. Privacy required active resistance rather than passive distance. The telephone also changed how people formed relationships. Long-distance friendships and romances became possible in ways they hadn't been before. You could maintain close connections with people you rarely or never saw in person. This expanded social networks, but also created relationships that existed primarily in mediated form. Some people were closer on the telephone than in person, more articulate without visual pressure, more intimate through distance. For businesses, the telephone was transformative. Companies could coordinate operations across multiple locations. Customer service could be centralized. Sales could be conducted remotely. The entire structure of business organization changed to accommodate telephone communication. Some industries, telemarketing, call centers, customer support, existed only because of telephones. The telephone also enabled new forms of community. Party lines in rural areas created shared communication spaces where neighbors would listen to each other's calls, not out of malice, but because that's how the system worked. Radio call-in shows allowed ordinary people to broadcast their voices to mass audiences. Telephone-based support groups connected people with shared experiences across vast distances. The telephone created communities not based on geography, but on connection. Yet for all its benefits, the telephone also contributed to social atomization. Before telephones, people maintained relationships through visits and letters, both of which required effort and intention. The telephone made connection easier, which paradoxically made it less meaningful. You could call anytime, so individual calls carried less weight. The ease of connection reduced the intensity of connection. The telephone operators, mostly women who had staffed switchboards for decades, were gradually replaced by automation. By the 1970s and 1980s, most calls were connected automatically. The operators who remained handled only specialized services, long distance, information, emergency calls. Their numbers dwindled. A profession that had employed hundreds of thousands disappeared, rendered obsolete by the technology it had served. Alexander Graham Bell lived to see the telephone become universal. He died in 1922 at age 75, having witnessed his invention transform from experimental curiosity to essential infrastructure. On the day of his funeral, telephone service across North America was suspended for 1 minute in his honor. For 60 seconds, the network fell silent. It was a remarkable tribute, the absence of sound honoring the man who had taught sound to travel. But Bell's relationship with his invention was complex. He was proud of the telephone but never loved it. He refused to have a telephone in his study, finding it disruptive to his thinking. He continued pursuing other inventions, improvements for the phonograph, experiments in aviation, studies of heredity, and eugenics. The telephone was his most famous achievement, but not his only interest or his only legacy. The forgotten pioneers, Bourseul, Rees, Gray, faded from popular memory. History remembers Bell as the telephone's inventor, though the truth is more complicated. Bourseul conceived the principle. Rees built the first working device. Gray filed for a patent the same day as Bell. Watson actually constructed the apparatus. Countless technicians, engineers, and operators made the system function. The telephone was not one man's invention, but the culmination of decades of experimentation by dozens of people. Yet Bell deserved his recognition. He didn't merely build a device that transmitted sound. He created a practical system that people could use. He fought legal battles to protect his patents. He promoted the telephone relentlessly, demonstrating it to skeptics, explaining its value, building the business that brought it to the world. Invention is not just conception, it's realization. Bell realized the telephone in ways that earlier inventors had not. The telephone story reveals a pattern common to transformative technologies. They begin as solutions to specific problems. Bell wanted to improve telegraph systems. They evolve in unexpected directions. The telephone became a social technology, not just a business tool. They create both benefits and costs, connection and disruption, liberation and obligation. And they become invisible through ubiquity. The miraculous becomes mundane. By the 21st century, the word telephone was becoming archaic. People carried smartphones that could do thousands of things, of which making voice calls was just one option. Young people texted more than they called. Video chat replaced some voice calling. Traditional telephone networks were being dismantled as communications moved to internet infrastructure. The telephone era was ending. But the fundamental achievement remained. Bell and his contemporaries had proven that distance could be overcome, that voices could travel through wires, that human connection could be maintained across vast separations. Every subsequent development in communications, radio, television, the internet, smartphones, built on this foundation. The telephone didn't just connect people. It established that connection was possible. Looking back from our hyper-connected age, it's difficult to imagine how revolutionary the telephone was. We take instant communication for granted. We expect to reach anyone, anywhere, anytime. We're frustrated by brief delays or poor signal quality. We've forgotten what it meant to be truly separated from others, to have no way of reaching them until we physically traveled to where they were. The telephone taught humanity that separation was negotiable, that distance was a problem technology could solve. But in solving that problem, it created new ones. Constant connectivity became expected. Solitude became difficult. The buffer that distance once provided vanished. We gained the ability to be everywhere and lost the ability to be nowhere. The experiment that let voices travel through wires succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Bell's 3 words, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you," echoed across a century and a half, amplified by billions of voices speaking across billions of connections. The telephone had connected humanity in ways that were both miraculous and mundane, liberating and constraining, enriching and impoverishing. And in that contradiction lay the telephone's truest legacy. It proved that technology could transform human experience, but it couldn't determine whether that transformation would be entirely beneficial. The telephone was a tool. Its value depended on how it was used, what it enabled, what it destroyed. Like all powerful tools, it amplified human capacities, both our capacity for connection and our capacity for intrusion, both our ability to bridge distance and our inability to let distance exist. Subscribe.